story of Drop-Tine. The year previous, he was a perfect 10. Beautiful. And the year before that, he was just a basket rat 8. And I don't know anything prior to that year, but I assumed him at 2.5. And then this year, I assumed him as a 3.5. And then, of course, when I shot him, I do believe he was a 4.5. But what's so special about this deer is this deer actually, his story begins a couple weeks prior. I had a mineral spot where I kind of got in a mineral regime there for a while and still do it some, mainly for cows and deer to mix. But this deer came in. He's kind of a small rack, looked like one of the smaller ones. And then last 2 or 3 weeks of velvet growth, he exploded. His tines were growing a couple inches a day. It looked like it. I've never seen a deer do quite that at the end. But he went from just a basket 8 into a ginormous 10 within a couple weeks. But this deer is very inconsistent, like any mature deer. They're hard to pattern unless you just have a corn pile or something, which I don't utilize corn too much. But with that being said, this deer had actually went off camera for probably about a week and a half. So I actually ended up hunting a different deer and was successfully killed that deer. Well, not too long after, I decided I'm just going to go see if I can get lucky and get this buck. And he actually came in perfect. The only problem was it was right at shooting light. And it was one of those days when it was a crescent moon. It was very little light in the air, borderline cloudy. And shooting light was still too dark. I pulled back my bow and it was a struggle to see. But your adrenaline's pumping, it's the deer you're after. I thought there's no issues. Well, right before I shot, I noticed I couldn't shoot because of a limb. The video doesn't do it justice, but there was a limb that I couldn't see to shoot. Thought I was going to hit my bow on that limb if he goes any farther right. So I rushed a shot. I shot high and forwards. At the time, didn't really know it until I went back and watched my video and lightened it up a little bit. But just a horrific shot. The worst shot I've ever done on the deer. And in fact, it's the only deer I've ever crippled with my bow. And I know it's probably not going to be my last. As any bow hunter knows, that it's, if you're in the woods enough and you shoot enough deer, you're going to make a bad shot at some point. You hope and you pray and you practice hours and hours hoping that never happens, but strong chance at some point it will, and just hope you respond adequately.
Well, it's pretty hot today. It's really windy. It was only supposed to be about, I don't know, 3-4 mile an hour winds, but there's gusts of 20-30. I originally was going to set up on this other side of this field back over this way, but the wind's coming out of the west, southwest, and I was unable to. My setup over there is not good for that, so I actually got down and then came over to this setup. The bad thing here is I think the deer are coming from that direction, and I think it'd be dark before they get over this way if they come in, but you never can tell. They're starting to change patterns, so we'll see what we see.
I gave him several hours. We went back with, in fact, Milo went in and got in on that. We tracked him for over 600 yards with blood. Tracked him another 100 miles, another 100 yards or so out without blood, and then he just lost sight, which gave me some hope, because that kind of tells me that he wasn't emitting the smell that kind of indicates of a bad deer. And Milo was struggling, starting to kind of mix him with other deer tracks that you could see in deer trails, and so it just wasn't a strong, potent smell, which made me think that this deer probably is going to make it, at least for the time being. While I hunted for him and had cameras out, never got pictures of him for another week. Ended up going on a vacation with my wife, and when we came back, I checked the camera 1.5 miles away from this, and there he was. Still had the arrow stuck in him. And Instantly, that became my season. Every spare minute, I was in the woods hunting that deer. Very inconsistent. I thought he had moved on out, but I'd get a game camera picture another half mile from where that was, and then he'd be back. About every 2 weeks, I was getting a picture. Well, come Thanksgiving time, when I actually noticed that his body was he was deteriorating away rather quickly, I actually noticed that, felt like I probably should call Game and Fish and see if I can shoot him with a rifle. Um, and this was right after the ending of uh, the rifle season, because he just looked so sick. I didn't. I said, no, this buck deserves, for me to at least see him out until it's just too far gone. I was sick to my stomach. I stayed up, you don't know how many nights. I was just distraught. How am I going to kill this deer? He's sick. It's because of me. But nonetheless, hunted hard. Um, Hunted all the way until January. He had, he just kept getting sicker and sicker looking. His body mass had shriveled down to nothing. Um, he started becoming a little bit more consistent. Well, in this process, I knew I kind of had narrowed him down to a 40-acre piece, and I had over a dozen cameras on a 40-acre piece, and he would only hit those cameras once every couple days, but it would always be a different camera. Well, there's a deep draw with kind of a spring and a couple ponds up above it between two fields, and this draw evidently was where he lived in, because I had my cameras up on the ridges surrounding it, and he would always be coming. And I'd try to say, well, he came from the left this time. This time he came from the right. Everything pointed down into this draw. Impossible to hunt with the thermals. Um, and I did everything I could to get as close to him as I thought I could. And by the time finally figured him out, he'd actually, I think it was the 14th of January, could have been the 28th. I'll have to look back in pictures, but he shed his antlers. And he looked very sick. Well, I didn't, honestly, I thought that deer was dead and he would never make it through. Um, my dad actually ended up finding these sheds in March while he was mushroom hunting. Early March, he decided to walk in there and see if he could find any mushrooms, and he found this right on a knoll, splitting two ravines. Perfect bedding area. Dad had stated there was multiple beds there. You could tell little rubs that was his hole for a couple weeks, probably for a couple months. But you could tell that was his bedroom, and I don't think he ever left it. I think he'd leave it once every couple days and go to a new location, but just hold up right there in one spot. Fast forward to the next year, I didn't think he'd make it. He looked pretty sick, as you can see in these photos. But lo and behold, a buck showed up on the mineral site, and his facial characteristics just told me that's him. That's that buck. He looked healthier than ever. So over that summer, he'd gained his body mass back. I do think the mineral helped in that aspect, and he grew out, and the same thing happened. Went from just a decent rack into his last couple of weeks, he blossomed out. The only thing different is he had went from a 10-pointer back to an 8-pointer, and then added that Drop-Tine on the opposite side of where he was shot, which tends to be a pretty common occurrence. The deformity happens on the opposite side of the accident or injury. Well, instantly he became my target buck. Very inconsistent. He started the year off back where I'd shot him the year previous. Not in the same location, but very close. And then about time bow season, first or second week of bow season come through, he had moved out. And I instantly thought he's coming back to his hole. And he did, but not to the same spot the sheds were. Kind of off a little bit. Another, probably I'd say a quarter mile away. But he would still kind of hang out in those areas, but very inconsistent. Ended up going a month without a game camera picture. I thought he'd moved off, after the injury and found somewhere new. I'm leaving this whole area. Well, then around Thanksgiving, he made an appearance. He showed back up, and then hunted him hard. I spent hours in the stands hunting him, and I'd had 2 or 3 encounters with this deer after that. And finally, on that Christmas season hunt, I took my bow and my gun. It was really cold that year. In fact, it was in single digits, but had a actually negative wind chill. Well, last day of that Christmas hunt, this deer finally broke through and came in. What I thought was, I'd ranged at 20. I was shivering. I could barely pull my bow back. What I thought was 20 yards turned to be 30. Flung an arrow, shot under him. I was sick. Glad I didn't cripple him a second time, but I was sick. And lo and behold, he comes back out, and I tried with my bow, and I could not pull back again that second time. It was so cold. So I had my gun, misfired 3 times, dry fired 3 times. Took my bullet ammo out. You could see that it had hit the primer. They just did not go off. Had 1 bullet left, about 2 minutes of shooting light, and I said, I made a gut decision and said, I'm gonna be just as happy with the gun as I would a bow on this deer. It was so cold for my cameras that day that I actually ended up not being able to finish that video. Didn't even think about using my phone. It was too hyped. So I have no footage walking up to this deer, just the shot and just the hunt. But that is the story of Drop-Tine. It went from the highs of highs to the lows of lows to the highs, back to the lows, and ultimately ended on a high. And as I say, he's not my biggest buck, but he's one of probably the most memorable bucks that I've ever killed. Hunting is so much more than rack, so much more than just shooting a deer. It's about the stories, about the time, it's about the effort, it's about what you learn, it's about just enjoying the outdoors. And this buck here gave me a whole new appreciation for hunting and the work that goes into it. And I hope you all enjoy that story. It's one of those, everybody has that. Everybody has one of those stories. So